Due to more frequent and longer heat waves and more intense rainstorms, scientists are more certain than ever that human-induced climate change is causing some types of extreme weather. What can be done to mitigate the effects of climate change? In this Talk of the Metropolis, Mr. Richard Lancaster, Chief Executive Officer of CLP Holdings, shares his insights on the topic Race to Zero, a 30-year challenge for a century-old industry, an attempt to achieve net zero by 2050 to combat climate change. He talks in particular about the importance of decarbonizing.
This is a particularly interesting time for us all. We're living in a time of crisis. We have health crises, we have energy crises going on, we have supply chain crises, and so trying to just keep a steady ship running, to keep our eye on the ball and continue to work on important issues like climate change is a lot tougher than it normally is. But I would like to say a few words about the energy crises that we are seeing around the world. If you live in Europe, you'll be reading the newspapers which will be telling you that gas prices have doubled, that we're coming up to the winter season and you can't expect that every day you'll be able to heat your home because some countries may not have enough natural gas. There's a heavy reliance on renewable energy, and in some parts of Europe we're seeing days when there's no wind blowing and there isn't enough gas, that there are shortages. We're seeing energy crises in China, where manufacturing has come back after the COVID pandemic, and the supply of energy isn't up to matching demand. So we're seeing shortages in many provinces around China. We are fortunate that we are not experiencing an energy crisis in Hong Kong. And that, I believe, comes about because we have a well-planned, well-coordinated, and a well-invested energy infrastructure here that builds redundancy, it caters for the unforeseen that happen all the time. So, touch wood, we're lucky to have escaped that in Hong Kong. But climate change is a crisis which is looming. We may be starting to see the effects of global warming, which today we've seen the average temperature rise around the planet at around 1.2 degrees Celsius. Now that doesn't sound much. 1 degree, okay, so what? But what that translates into is much fiercer storms, much more variability in the weather. We're seeing rainfall happen much more heavily than it has in the past. We're seeing rain in areas where it hasn't rained for many years. We've seen droughts occurring where it used to rain, and so the weather is definitely changing, and the weather patterns are changing. And that's just 1.2 degrees. And that's what we have so far done to our planet. Projections are that by 2040 we'll have reached 1.5 degrees. By 2060 that will increase to 3 degrees if we carry on the way that we're continuing to produce greenhouse gases. And by the end of this century, 5.7 degrees is the projection. Now, I've been following the science of climate change, and I've been following the debates around climate change for many years. And to me, the science of climate change is irrefutable. That if you study physics, as I did when I was a university student, you will learn about the greenhouse effect, that if you put certain gases in the atmosphere, it traps heat into the planet, and it's got nowhere to escape. That is physics, and you can study that in textbooks, and you can sit exams on that. It's scientific fact. What we don't necessarily understand that well is what happens to our planet as the temperature rises. And when we hit these milestones that I've just been talking about, 1.2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees, 5.7 degrees, what's going to happen to the planet? And I think you'll get a sense that if already with 1.2 degrees we are seeing more extreme weather, then as we get more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more and more greenhouse gases, this is only going to get worse. And we can only surmise how bad it's going to be. But 5.7 degrees by the end of this century could well be intolerable in some parts of the world. We could be seeing storms of such magnitude that our existing infrastructure just cannot cope with it. Sea levels rising. So this is really what climate change is all about. It is about making sure that our planet doesn't become uninhabitable. We've seen how fragile our economies have become just with the COVID pandemic. Just think about how disrupted our supply chains are, how disrupted our economies have become, just how much change it's affected us. And that's just because of a disease. Now think how worse that would be if we let climate change go out of control. So in order to avoid an ecological disaster of such proportions that it will disrupt our lives completely, we need to be planning well ahead. We need to be taking this very seriously. And it's going to take a lot of coordination, a lot of investment, and it's going to take a lot of very careful work by all of us. Now, if you've read in the news, you'll have seen that we had a conference in Glasgow over the past few weeks. It was an important event in the climate circles. There is a conference of the parties held every year. This was the 26th one. There wasn't one held in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic, so this was actually held a year late. But an event such as COP26 is very important for creating alignment. It's also very important for setting a policy direction. So as you get international agreements, the details of those agreements can sometimes be a little bit hard to follow or a bit hard to understand, but it is important that you get a sense of the importance of setting a policy direction. When you have almost every country in the world has signed on to the Paris Agreement in 2015 and a commitment to further tighten up their climate targets, when you have an agreement that 5 years from Paris, all the countries would sit down and have agreed a rule book by which all of the climate policies will be enforced. These are important because they send a signal to whole areas of society, to the business sectors, to say, we're taking this seriously, this is important, and these rules are going to be ones that we abide by. So if I look at how successful COP26 was, or how unsuccessful, there are some very differing views, but I think the best summary I came across was that if you consider the state of global geopolitics and just how difficult it is to agree anything in the world today, then COP26 certainly exceeded everybody's expectations. But if you consider the state of the scientific opinion, then COP26 fell very short of what was needed. So it wasn't just a glass half full, glass empty. There were some very important positives that came out of it, but it did fall short in a number of areas. What did it achieve? Well, there is now a rule book that followed on from the Paris Agreement. Some would say it hasn't achieved all it set out to achieve because there may well be some glaring gaps in that rule book. It achieved a phasing down of coal, and that was the first mention of coal in an international agreement. However, some argue that it didn't go far enough and that phasing down wasn't enough. It should have been phasing out coal completely. If you look at all the national contributions that went in towards the tightening of climate policies, we now have alignment around somewhere around 2.4 degrees of global warming. But there is an agreement to review targets earlier. So our 2030 targets will be reviewed a few years earlier in 2022 rather than 2025. So one important thing is that we kept the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is considered important. It's considered a level of global warming where the consequences to the planet may not be as bad as people may fear. But 1.5 degrees is considered not safe, but probably on the basis of scientific opinion, we can live with 1.5 degrees, but it's kept that hope alive. Now, stabilizing global warming at any temperature, whether it's 1.5, 2, 3, 5, or whatever, in order to stabilize, then you have to stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. If you keep emitting greenhouse gases, then global warming is just going to increase. So when we talk about stabilizing these at these temperatures, it means that we have to get to net zero emissions by a certain time. And net zero is a concept which, if you think about the fact that trees and oceans take some greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, we can afford to emit as much as the planet naturally takes out. So it's not necessarily zero, but it is pretty close to zero. But it is important that we achieve that by a certain time. And 2050 is considered to be an important milestone. It's not that if we sit back and wait till 2050, everything will happen, but we've got a timetable to work to over the next 30 years to achieve net zero by 2050. And that is where the world is coalescing around a timetable and a target, net zero by 2050. I'd like to now move on to what CLP and how CLP views climate change and net zero by 2050. CLP has a document which it published back in 2007 called its Climate Vision 2050. So back in 2007, we felt that it was important enough to publish a document which outlined our thoughts and our plans and our targets to decarbonize our business by 2050. Why did we think it was important back then? Not everyone was as concerned about climate change then as they are now, but it was important to create alignment. We needed to communicate to our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers, our employees. Anybody that has an interest in our business needed to know how we viewed climate change, because our business was one that generated a lot of its income from producing electricity from coal-fired power. And we viewed that as being unsustainable in a world which was aiming towards net zero, and we needed to change our business. We have progressively updated, and we have made a lot of progress over the last 14 years since we first published our Climate Vision 2050. And every few years, we update our targets, the most recent one being this year in 2021. And if you look at where our business is at the moment, We have now moved to a point where around 2/3 of our business now comes from carbon-free activities. So we have reduced the percentage of profits that we make from coal down to around 23% of our business. We still have electricity produced from natural gas, which is another 12%. But aside from those, every other aspect of our business is carbon-free. And our aim is to have our business carbon-free as quickly as we can. And I'll explain why. So we have updated again our targets in 2021, and we will aim to have our business completely net zero by 2050, to be phasing out coal completely a decade earlier by 2040, to be adopting science-based targets, and science-based targets means that these are targets which see our path towards achieving net zero in line with what it would take to keeping the global warming to well below 2 degrees. So those are science-based targets for 2030 and 2040. And we have committed to review our targets at least every 5 years. In practice, we review them much more frequently than 5 years. In fact, even though we've only just published these over the last couple of months, we're already working on revised targets. So, to get a business such as CLP's decarbonized as quickly as possible is really important because we provide an essential commodity to economies such as Hong Kong. We have operations in Australia, in India, and mainland China. And unless the electricity sector can decarbonize quickly, then the rest of the economy will struggle because electricity can be decarbonized. And once it is decarbonized, it can then be a replacement for other forms of energy, which are not so easy to decarbonize. Now, when you look at our fuel mix in Hong Kong, and I'll just take Hong Kong as an example. This is how CLP provided electricity to 80% of the population last year in 2020. We made a big shift in that year to make about half of our electricity from natural gas. Natural gas produces about half the carbon dioxide per unit of electricity as coal. So that shift cuts carbon emissions in half if you shift from coal to natural gas. That's an important step because you need to move quickly and you can't wait until 2050 and hope to do everything because of all those emissions over that 30 years are all still going to be in the atmosphere and they'll all still be contributing to global warming. So any action that you do, you have to do it quickly and as best you can at the time. So we've made quite a significant shift from coal to natural gas. In the early 1990s, we invested in a nuclear power station in Guangdong province called the Daya Bay Nuclear Power Station. Now, nuclear power has zero carbon dioxide emissions. So already 36% of our power comes from zero carbon energy. And over 2020, we've worked with the government and we've worked with our customers to promote as much renewable energy as possible. So that 1% is a very small contribution, but a very important contribution of having renewable energy in our mix. Now, for Hong Kong to decarbonize as an economy, what we need to do is three things. Firstly, we need to be as energy efficient as possible. And energy efficiency is important because the less energy that's used, the quicker we can convert our electricity supply to be carbon-free. So it is important that we don't waste energy. If we waste energy, then that just makes our job harder and it will take longer to decarbonize. So energy efficiency is very important. Second thing that we need to do is to decarbonize our electricity supply as quickly as possible. Once you've done that, then the third thing that you need to do is use electricity as much as possible. So be as energy as efficient as you possibly can, decarbonize your electricity supply as quickly as possible, and then use as much electricity as you can in place of other carbon-emitting forms of energy. And that strategy is being adopted all over the world. Any energy policy or any carbon policy basically follows those three steps. And if you look at the Hong Kong government's climate action plan that was published shortly after the Chief Executive's policy address, there are 4 elements in there. One is net zero electricity, one is energy saving, one is green transportation, and the 4th one is waste reduction. And if you think about that framework that I described, well, energy saving falls in there as getting ourselves as energy efficient as possible. The net zero electricity is there, and they've talked about green transport and waste reduction as ways of using electricity instead of other processes. So this is consistent. The Hong Kong government's plan is consistent with that broad strategy. Now, when you talk about decarbonising the electricity supply, what you need to consider is that we have existing infrastructure. The coal and the natural gas that are on this chart here are produced in power plants, very large power plants, and in order to decarbonise, what we need to do is to build a replacement capacity or convert those power plants to carbon-free forms of energy. So what we have to do is build something new, and we have to get it working reliably, and then we can shut down the carbon-emitting forms of power. Now, I talked about a shift from coal to natural gas, and what we have completed is a new gas-fired generating unit. This was built and finished last year. There is a second unit just behind this one. It's a construction site at the moment, so you can't see it. But a second unit is under construction as well. So all of this infrastructure needs to be built and needs to be working reliably before we can shut down more polluting forms of power, such as coal-fired power. And that's essentially what decarbonising the electricity sector means. It means that we have to build a replacement electricity system that is built around carbon-free electricity rather than fossil fuels. When we do that, we have to make sure that it's running reliably. We can't afford to have an electricity system that lets the lights go out or the lifts stop in our high-rise buildings, or our computers shut down. Because Hong Kong is a logistics port, it's a finance centre, and most of us either live or work in a high-rise building. So we need to be able to get to and from home and to and from our offices. So the electricity supply needs to be running reliably. Hong Kong's an economy that relies completely on imports. Every form of energy that we use in Hong Kong has to be imported. So energy security is vitally important. And when I started my talk and I talked about the energy crises, these are crises that are caused in supply chains in many cases. If we don't have access to multiple supply chains and diversity in our supply chains, then we'll have an energy crisis here, and that would be unthinkable for us. So we have to think about energy security. We also have to think about affordability as well, because the price of energy is something that we all have to live with. It flows into our economy. It is something that we don't have a choice about. We have to buy energy to heat our homes, to cook our food, to transport, to move ourselves around. So affordability is really important as well. So when we're putting a plan together, we have to think about using technologies which are reliable and proven. These are not things that are in the research institutes or in pilot schemes. We've only got 30 years, and so we have to start building now. And so this has to be reliable, proven technology. We have to think regionally as well. If we just limit our thinking to the boundary of Hong Kong, it would be like New York or London or Paris saying, we want to be carbon neutral, we want to have a decarbonised electricity supply, but we're going to draw a line around us and try and do everything within our city limits. And that would be crazy. So Hong Kong needs to think regionally as well. We can't do everything just within our boundaries. And so let's look at some of our choices. And I've started here with natural gas. And if you've been following what I've been saying, you would have heard me say that natural gas has about half the carbon intensity of coal-fired power. So that will get us half the way to net zero. But we've still got the other half to deal with. And what can we do about that? Well, we see natural gas as a stepping stone, that this is a transition towards a carbon-free fuel, and that fuel is hydrogen. If you've studied chemistry in high school, which many of you I'm sure have, you will know that natural gas is methane, which is a carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms. And if you take away the carbon, what you're left with is hydrogen. And hydrogen is a source of energy, it's a fuel that can be burned, and it is carbon-free. And if hydrogen is produced from renewable energy, and we use the term green hydrogen, then green hydrogen can be a carbon-free source of energy. And if we produce hydrogen in enough quantities, we can use it in a natural gas power plant that's been repurposed as a hydrogen power plant. Now, the technology to produce hydrogen from renewable energy was invented in the, I think it was the 1830s. It was the early 1800s. And it was about 3 weeks after Alessandro Volta invented the battery. So this is really old technology. This is something that we have had in our toolkit for centuries. The reason that we haven't made hydrogen from electricity in the past has been that it's been expensive and there's been cheaper ways of doing it. Now, in a world where we can't afford to emit carbon, and in a world where we start to get really interested in producing hydrogen from renewable energy, this technology, all of a sudden, the economics of this technology changes. Because if everybody wants green hydrogen, and we have this existing technology, and all we need to do is to produce it at scale, and if we produce it at scale, the cost of that technology will come down, then very quickly we can see that green hydrogen could be a very economic source of a carbon-free fuel for us. Now, in Hong Kong, we get a lot of our natural gas along a 6,000-kilometre natural gas pipeline that runs all the way from Central Asia. It runs to our power plant at Black Point. And all along that pipeline, there is areas of desert where there's plenty of sunshine, there's areas where there's phenomenal wind resources, and there's lots of solar parks and wind farms already being produced. And sometimes there's so much wind and so much sunshine that these power plants produce too much energy, and it can't be fed along the transmission lines across to the cities on the coast where it's needed. So rather than waste that energy, all you need to do is to add some electrolyzers, which is the technology shown on this slide here, and you can produce hydrogen. And it can be fed into the pipeline, and you can gradually increase the amount of hydrogen and reduce the amount of natural gas over time. So this is something that can start today, and in the next 30 years, we will see the percentage of hydrogen increasing to the point where hopefully we'll be close to or at 100% hydrogen. Now, another technology, again, a very old technology, is offshore wind power. And we had a look about 10 years ago at the possibility of building an offshore wind farm in Hong Kong. It's technically feasible, it's environmentally feasible, but it was really expensive at the time. And the reason it was really expensive is that if you look at this chart and you look over on the left at 2010, the biggest wind turbine that you could buy at the time was 3 megawatts. Today, you can buy wind turbines that are 12 megawatts, which is 4 times bigger. So you only need 1/4 of the number of wind turbines to get the same capacity. By 2030, the 15 megawatt wind turbines, which are already starting to be available today, and the 20 megawatt wind turbines will be commercially available, and that improves the economics even further. So offshore wind is now an economically viable technology for Hong Kong. And we have areas of sea. We all know that land is quite scarce in Hong Kong. If you're in the shipping business, you also realize that the sea is quite scarce in Hong Kong, but we do have some areas where we can build wind farms. But if you go just a little bit outside Hong Kong's boundary, there is space there that we could build even bigger wind farms. And the bigger a wind farm, the more economically viable it is because of economies of scale. So wind power could be around 10%. The government's climate action plan talks about a range somewhere between 7.5% and 15%, but let's say around 10% of our energy mix. So with hydrogen, with offshore wind, with nuclear power that we already have, we've got 3 elements there that can combine together to make a decarbonised electricity supply for Hong Kong. We may need a little bit more nuclear power. We may need to make sure that we've got sufficient offshore wind capacity and sufficient hydrogen capacity to cope for days when there is no wind blowing or when we have disruptions. All of this will have to be carefully pieced together and built in a carefully coordinated way. And we will also have to use other new technologies that are available. And batteries are one. This is an example of a battery that is sitting at the international airport in Hong Kong. And it helps provide a more stable electricity supply to the airport. Again, these are old existing technologies which have become more economically viable as scale has increased. So with batteries used at strategic points around our distribution system, we will then have all the elements that we need to have a reliable, affordable, and decarbonised electricity supply for Hong Kong. Now, I hope you've all got an idea that it can be done, that we can decarbonise our electricity supply. Once we have decarbonised it, carbon-free electricity can be used for transportation. We're seeing the growth of electric cars in Hong Kong, electric buses, electric trucks, and many of the processes that we use fossil fuels for today can be replaced by electricity. And I hope you've also taken away the importance of a policy which supports energy efficiency, decarbonising electricity, and promoting the wider use of electricity throughout all sectors of the economy. And I'm sure you've got loads of questions. So we've got plenty of time for questions, and I'll stop there, and perhaps we'll move into question time.
First of all, on behalf of the university, I would like to thank Mr. Lancaster for a wonderful talk. You have given us a lot of hope. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, both people here and those online. And who wants to go first? Go ahead, Professor Kong.
Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. I'm truly impressed by what CLP have already done to reduce the carbon emission. But I would like to know more about, from your perspective, what the government can do further to facilitate this kind of policy. So what else do you think they can do more to do that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important question because we're moving from a time when it's formulating policies, setting targets, and now moving into a time where action is needed. And we now have a plan in Hong Kong, the government's Climate Action Plan 2050. Hong Kong is one of the first jurisdictions that has actually produced a plan. Many countries have formulated targets. Many of them have got policies which have outlined what's needed, but to actually have a plan is quite rare today. But now that you have a plan, the job is to get it implemented. And so we need to start as quickly as possible. In our industry, 30 years is a very short space of time. So to us, this is needing a sense of urgency. And so what we need to do is to really get on with this. All of the changes that I've outlined will all have to go through various government processes. The faster we can make sure that they're getting into those processes and working through efficiently, the faster these changes can be brought about. We have a lot of change that's going to be necessary over the next 30 years. So it really is one where government needs to be very supportive of all of these changes. These won't all be done by CLP. Many areas of society will need to be part of this. And looking at the wider use of electric vehicles, for example, everybody that is a vehicle owner or an owner of fleet vehicles will need to start making preparations to change. So every aspect of society will need to be moving forward. But this is a time for action.
Great. Second question? I'm still waiting for those online. Dr. Lee?
The last question was about the government. I'm more interested in the general public. Typical citizens like most of us here. What, in your opinion, can we do to help achieve the net zero, the very important target?
Well, I outlined the importance of energy efficiency, and this is something everybody can play a role in. And energy efficiency is really important because, for the reasons I've outlined, the more energy that everybody uses, the longer it's going to take us to change our electricity supply. That's one area that the entire community can play a part in, is just to make sure that we are not wasting energy, that we're using it as efficiently as possible. I think the other area is in thinking about how climate change is going to affect our lives, our businesses, every aspect of society. We use the term adaptation when we talk about climate change. It's recognizing that we can't stop it. It's not as if we can just suddenly say, we'll make some changes and it'll stop. It's not going away. That the 1.2 degrees is already caused by carbon that has been emitted since the Industrial Revolution. We can't just take it out of the atmosphere and stop climate change. The effects that we're seeing of the carbon that's already been emitted, we're only starting to see the beginning of that. As the planet warms up, these effects will get stronger. So we need to prepare ourselves. And I think with adaptation, it is getting our thoughts together and getting our plans together around how that will affect us. Now, governments will need to play a very important role. And just to follow on from that previous point, I should have said a little bit more about adaptation, because that is a role that governments need to take. In some parts of the world where flooding and sea level rises are already being seen, governments are taking action to protect communities. But we will be living in a world which is hotter, where storms are more severe, where rainfall will be way beyond what we see today. Our businesses, everything about our society will be affected by that. And we will all need to play some role in contributing to a more robust and a more resilient society.
Go ahead. Professor Gibson.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate what CLP is doing. Where I have less confidence is on Hong Kong getting more energy efficient. The government has set a target for between 15 and 20% improvement between 15 and 2035. Now, if we look at what happens so far, between 2005 and 2019, we actually increased the amount of energy we consume in buildings by about 21%. So how are we going to change from that increase to this big decrease? Part of the reason for the increase, of course, is that we've built more buildings. And my understanding is we're going to continue to build more buildings. We're going to have the Northern Metropolis, etc. So how, with the increase in buildings that we're expecting, are we going to get this reduction?
It's an unfortunate paradox, and you're absolutely right, Robert. We need more buildings because we've got pressure on housing. There is a need to build more housing accommodation. We're needing to diversify our economy as well, so new industries, and many of these new industries may well be energy-intensive industries as well. You just look at data centers and modern technology that does consume lots of energy. The good news is that anything new that we build, we have an opportunity to get it right. So if there is a new housing estate or a new industry, we have an opportunity to make it as energy efficient as we can. It's a lot easier to build better energy efficiency into something new than it is to go back and change an existing housing. So I think it's inevitable. Yes, we will need more buildings. It's inevitable that buildings do consume energy, but we really need to make sure that we're grabbing this opportunity to make those new industries and new buildings as energy efficient as possible.
Thank you. The gentleman on the right.
My decision to attend this presentation was very, very swift and sudden. But I'm so pleased I made it because it was not only inspiring and engaging in terms of its subject matter, but also wonderful in the sense of the coherence and the tone of it. So from an academic perspective, I think it has been a very fulfilling afternoon for everybody. And I'm profoundly grateful to you for those two different dimensions that are complementary to one another. However, for somebody who comes from Eastern Europe, and who was a child when the disaster of Chernobyl happened, for somebody who happened to be in Japan immediately after the Fukushima earthquake and tsunami 11 years ago, there is a question that is virtually unavoidable, and I'm sure you yourself have pondered it many, many times, and it addresses the question of the nuclear energy as a potential solution. What about the risks involved, and what is your personal view on that dimension, which can, in a sense, change everything in an instant? Thank you very much in advance for what I'm sure will be a very, very profound answer. Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your comments, and it really is an important question. And I've been involved with climate change for a long time, and I've also been involved with the nuclear industry for a long time as well. One thing I've found, the more you learn about the nuclear industry and the more you understand it, the more comfortable you get with the risks. The more you learn about climate change and understand climate change, the less comfortable you feel about it. In a perfect world, if we didn't have climate change, we may be able to make some choices, but nuclear power is carbon-free. It is a well-understood and well-proven technology. It does work reliably. And yes, there have been a handful of incidents throughout its history. You've mentioned two of them, Fukushima, Chernobyl. There was also 3 Mile Island. Those are three that I think everybody will have heard about. Now, I could talk about the dangers of every energy source. I could talk about coal mining in China in the 1990s, where as many people were dying every week in coal mining accidents as were impacted by all three of those incidents in their totality. So energy does have safety issues that it has to deal with, whichever form of energy that you're dealing with. Some of the worst disasters that have happened with energy sources have been hydroelectric dams that have burst and flooded entire communities. Now, every energy source has to be designed to be safe. You have to build that safety into it. You have to understand the risks. And in some cases, we've learned from mistakes. We don't build hydroelectric dams the way that we built them in the 1950s. We don't build nuclear power stations the way that they were built in the 1960s in some cases. And Fukushima and Chernobyl were of that vintage. So today, we've learned a lot in the nuclear industry. And when you look at the continual evolution of designs of nuclear power stations, we build today what's called Generation 3 technology. There's already plants which are on the drawing board for Generation 4 technology. So it is an evolving technology. The safety standards and the safeguards have been built in because of what was learnt from the lessons of Fukushima and Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. I feel, and I've worked very closely with the nuclear industry in China, and Daya Bay Nuclear Power Station was the first commercial-scale nuclear power plant in China. It was built with investment by CLP. We invested 25% in the equity of the plant, and we currently take 80% of the electricity from it. So we've had a very big say in how that plant is run. Our partners, the China General Nuclear Power Company, grew up with Daya Bay, and they worked with our managers. They've adopted our standards. So we've worked very closely with them, and they're very aligned with how we like to operate. Over the years, when there's been any question marks about Daya Bay and whether it's operating safely, we've worked very hard with our partners to make its operation as transparent as possible. And I think transparency is absolutely crucial. If you can see what's going on, and if you have trust in the integrity of the communications, then you'll build a level of comfort. So I think we can look at Daya Bay as an example. If Hong Kong is going to take its electricity from a nuclear power plant, it should have a say in how it runs. It should have assurances around transparency. And so I think we can do it. We have done that with Daya Bay. And if we are to take more nuclear power, then I think that would be the model that we should be looking for.
Thank you. We tend to be very defensive, cut this and cut carbon and so on. Can we be more offensively minded, like your hydrogen idea? What about silly planting trees? 7 million of us, we plant a tree every year. So we add that up to the whole world. We plant 8 billion trees a year. Would that help?
The answer is yes, absolutely. And when you look at projections for stabilizing carbon in the atmosphere, we are likely to find that there are some sectors of our economy that is just really hard to completely decarbonize. So we may find that it's almost impossible to get all the way to net zero. And there may be a small residual amount of carbon or methane emissions that just keep pushing the temperature up. So if we can boost the planet's ability to absorb carbon dioxide, then that may be a very important part of the solution. So you've seen, as part of COP26, one of the important agreements I perhaps should have mentioned, but it's good that I had this opportunity, is an agreement to stop deforestation. And that will help retain the trees that we have that will absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We need to go further than that. We actually need to reforest what we've already deforested. So this needs to be done on massive scale. And this is where, at the moment, these are what we call natural carbon solutions. These are things just naturally will contribute to reducing global warming. And at the moment, most of the investment that's going into natural carbon solutions is done by government. And this is beyond the capabilities of government. We need to mobilize more private investment into reforestation and to stop deforestation. So yes, it's a very important point.
Great. Because of time, one last question. Let's give that to our chairman.
As you mentioned in your talk, CLP also wants to see reducing carbon as soon as possible. I'd like to know, from your perspective, how likely it would be for CLP to accelerate your decarbonization efforts in the years ahead, say, for example, by 2030, 2040. I ask this, that's because of what you've mentioned about the availability of new technology, new energy sources. So are there any other ways, or how likely that can be achieved? Thank you.
It's a very important question. I talked about how frequently we revise our targets and adjust our plans. And in the last 18 months, we've found that the pace of change has really picked up. We've got to the point now where no sooner do we publish our revised targets than we're already working on the next one, the next iteration, because the world is actually moving much more quickly than I think many people realize. So what I feel is behind this is that we're now getting much closer alignment, that we're not debating amongst ourselves whether climate change is a reality or not. We're getting alignment now and saying, okay, we're accepting this, we've set a target, we'll be decarbonized by 2050. Governments, industries, whole communities are now getting behind a target and now sitting down to formulate plans. In Hong Kong, we're now at the stage where we're ready to start executing those plans. So I think that alignment has really picked up the pace. Michael, you also mentioned innovation. The research that's going into technologies and the pace of change in technology is just happening at a phenomenal pace. So every day I'm surprised by new ideas or new things that are being tried, and so all of these will help. And I can't predict what will happen in the next 10 years, because if I think back 10 years ago, there was no way I'd have predicted how far we would have moved already by today. So I'm confident that we'll be able to accelerate and move much more quickly. I think what we have is a very good plan, but it's also a flexible plan, because as new technologies come in and as circumstances change, we can adjust that and we can take advantage of that. And I'm hopeful and I'm quietly confident that we'll be able to do a lot better than what I've outlined today. So if you invite me back in 10 years, I might have a much better story to tell.
Okay. Good. So we have a date in 10 years. Okay, thank you very much once again.
Thank you, everyone.